Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfa. Let's talk about some wolves. Joining us today from Northeast Washington, by his own account, he is a small business owner who now manages a human-wildlife conflict mitigation business called G.R.I.P.H, spelled G.R.I.P.H. That is also the name of his horse. Daniel Curry, it is a pleasure to have you here on the podcast with Stephen and myself. How are you doing today, sir?
Hey, not bad, John. Thank you. And
Thank
very much appreciative to giving some time on talking about this subject. So thanks to you and Stephen. Nice meeting you guys virtually.
No, it's great. And I got your name from Dr. Mark Johnson, who we had on the podcast, a couple weeks ago. And he said you would be an excellent person to talk to because we were talking about humane trapping techniques and study techniques. And you've had this really incredible journey. I was reading through your website, which is phenomenal, by the way. Great job designing it and lays everything out perfectly. So just give everybody no problem. And just give everybody a little bit of your background because you went into such detail on the website, but tell everyone how you got started with going down this path of basically conflict resolution with predators and prey and livestock and things of that sort in Washington and how you ended up there.
Yeah, it was quite a journey. It's still in the process, actually. So kind of started, I guess you could probably say in my 20s. I spent all of my 20s working at a wolf sanctuary. It's a world-renowned sanctuary in Washington on the west side in a little town called Tenino, Washington. The name of the facility is Wolf Haven International, and really remarkable place. Do a lot of good work there. And I had some veterinary medicine skill before that. I was a vet tech, and it kind of just went right in and helped me kind of obtain that job. And then I could utilize my veterinary medical background and kind of help in animal husbandry, and quickly became their lead animal care and learned just a tremendous amount about wolves myself, about the dynamics between people and wolves, how polarizing they are. And I mean, the list goes on there. So it kind of, what happened, short version there is kind of felt my wheels spinning towards when I started to be about 30 years old. And, I was working in a sanctuary and an amazing place doing amazing work, but I kept hearing of all these kind of atrocities happening to wolves outside of the bounds of that sanctuary, and felt like, man, it seems like that's the place to maybe be on the front lines to help make a difference and help bring solutions to the table. I think that would be kind of the most advantageous move for me at that point. I was thinking to just inject myself into that community, like get on those front lines and just really be a part of that process, because it's really hard to even assess accurately what's going on the ground in a process, especially this epic of a size. This is a very, it's a large topic. Like if we follow wolves at all, we know that it's an extremely polarizing subject. And the W word over here in Northeast Washington is very inflammatory in certain situations. So I felt like I needed to be a part of that directly. So I pulled up a map, actually, and at the time it was a map of the population of wolves in Washington State, and it indicated where all the packs were geographically, and they're predominantly in Northeast Washington. All the known animals at that time were locked up in this little corner of our state, which happened to be where the majority of our public land grazing operations are. So it's a lot of overlap, a lot of potential conflict. And there was one instance that comes to mind, especially in 2012. There was the extirpation of the wedge pack, and we lost those animals. They were killed. We paid our state Fish and Wildlife Department to go in there and kill them. As taxpayers, we paid a pretty hefty sum for that. And that livestock producer lost their cattle. And it was just kind of it was a lose-lose-lose situation that I felt had tons of room for potential improvement. So I was like, well, I guess I'll move up there. So I came up to a little town near Colville, or in Northeast Washington, called Colville, and tried to find a place to rent. I was blessed enough to find that place, moved all my animal family over here, and kind of didn't know what to do at that point. So it kind of started immediately as just, I have to do something to obviously feed my family. So I'm going to do some odd jobs for folks, just get to know the community while I try and formulate a plan of how to actually help bring solutions to the table, of how to bridge the disconnect, so to speak, with environmentalists and the livestock community and just all the other members of the community that aren't maybe livestock producers or extreme environmentalists, but just people that really maybe aren't aware of the subject, and then, kind of empower them via awareness and education to maybe be a part of it. So I didn't know what I was going to do at first. I thought maybe, I don't know, write a book about my experiences at Wolfhaven. Maybe that'll help. And I was like, oh, that's not going to really help. You're just kind of going to be preaching to the choir, shouting into an echo chamber, so to speak. So I was like, well, I'll look at this thing called range riding. It's been done in other areas with some success. And there really was no avenue for me to find a job as a range rider. Nobody was hiring them. Nobody was doing anything like that. So I started my own small business. I was like, well, I'll create a business and hire myself, and that's what I'll do. So I created a business, named it after my horse Griff that you mentioned. I appreciate that, John. He's the namesake of this. So, but yeah, I just started that. And the acronym that business name stands for kind of says it all. It's guarding the respective interests of predators and humans. And that's exactly what I'm trying to go about doing, and kind of facilitate that by becoming a buffer between these animals and the communities that are being affected in a lot of ways, maybe negatively, because there isn't a better source. There isn't a better service out there right now that's maybe assisting and helping in these communities. So why not offer that service and be that person? Does that kind of answer your question in a nutshell? Or?
No, I think it does. And I know, Stephen, you had something you wanted to jump in here. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, just a general question for folks that might not be familiar with the term. What exactly does a range rider do?
Oh, man, that's a good question, Stephen. I get that question a lot. And there's really, that's twofold answer, I guess. Right now, if you look at the big spectrum, range rider, there is no standardization. So that's one mission of mine that I'm trying to help kind of bring to the table, is like, we need to standardize this. I mean, we've had range riders that are literally just doing nothing out in the woods, saying that's range riding, and that's actually really problematic, as you can imagine. And then we have people like myself that are spending large stints of time out in the woods, learning about how the cattle are utilizing that landscape, learning how the other animals in the landscape, such as, primarily the focus is on wolves, but definitely my work will encompass and be effective to help deter cougars and bears as well from looking at livestock as a food source. So the normal 9 to 5 doesn't really exist in this job, Stephen. It's kind of like the best way I can put it is to act as to do this in an effective manner, and to act as a quality buffer between livestock and, let's just say, wolves. We're just going to talk about wolves specifically. To do that accurately, you have to basically be active during the times that wolves are active, overlay your activity over the cattle's presence and their location. And then that's all night sometimes. So in the morning, you utilize your daylight hours to basically locate cattle, assess behavior and health, behavior being the first indication that something is wrong. I learned that just in many years working with animal husbandry. Behavior is going to be the first step to go, well, something's odd there. So if I maybe see a cow by herself without a calf and she's bawling, I need to find what's wrong with that calf. And by bawling, I mean, a lot of times when cows are in distress, they'll sit there and vocalize, and there's a specific vocalization that kind of tells you that something's wrong with that animal. So if that animal's exhibiting like that, and then maybe has a tight udder, like a tight bag is what they call it, like she hasn't nursed in maybe 12 hours, let's say, then something's happened to her calf. I need to go locate that animal. Maybe the calf is just stranded. Maybe it's in the bog. Maybe it's actually, maybe it's been injured or killed by a predator. And at that point, then that kind of tailors your day at that point. Now it's kind of a crime scene we have to lay out. Try and preserve as much sign as we can, try and find out what actually happened, because sometimes animals are blamed for kills that don't happen. Animals will have a mechanical injury on the landscape. Let's say by animals, I mean cattle, sorry. Cattle maybe have a mechanical injury on the landscape, like they injure their ankle or something, or they injure somehow their leg in some capacity that might be normally not a big deal if the calf stays with the mom. It's not, it's still relatively protected. But when you actually have an apex predator in the landscape, and a food source that's not kind of native to that landscape, it's can be obviously a potential there for conflict. Because once wolves go, hey, wait, instead of chasing that elk or that deer that's extremely nimble and adapted running through the forest, maybe I'll go after this little calf or this injured cow. So a lot of times your day is depicting or is dependent on what you find, I guess, to answer your question. But generally, long nights, long days. Like I said, wolves are crepuscular. I should mention that. So active dawn and dusk primarily. So that's when a lot of activity time happens for me regarding trying to actually be that buffer in the landscape. And then during the day, you're finding cattle. You're trying to also locate where the wolves were. Maybe they weren't around you the night before. So where are they and what are they doing? And if you find that they're in an area of the allotment, these public grazing allotments, that they're safe in and there's no potential for conflict because cows haven't gone up there and they have a strong prey base, then you can leave them there and just focus on your cattle. Because there's other things that are in my day too. Maybe some range stewardship I've been trying to focus on a lot is trying to help the rancher at that point utilize their range space a little bit more efficiently, obviously with the permission of the rancher at that point, to maybe utilize strategic grazing practices and kind of move them into areas that have good forage and maybe keep them out of other areas that they shouldn't be in, maybe like sensitive riparian zones, things like that. So kind of a wide range of day, and it's never like really, there's never really a normal. You really lose track of your days, I think, because you're long stints that I'm staying out there. I'm not just driving out and coming back. So spend a lot of time out in the mountains doing that. Does that adequately answer that question? Or?
Yeah.
Cool. There's
awesome,
a lot.
yeah.
There's a lot of information. So sometimes I'll just go off on tangents, you guys. So give me back on track.
No, tangents are good. No, and
we like them.
your answers are so in depth, and there were a couple questions that came up for me just in what you were saying. So when you're you kind of a jack of all trades in this scenario, because you say just range rider, but you're the crime scene investigator. You're helping, like you said, the stewardship with the ranching community. What is that typically like? And are the encounters, are they helpful? Do they want to work with you? Do they want to learn these other methods and be, like you said, be more efficient in using the landscape? Are they hands off? They don't want you to come there. How do you approach any particular situation when you realize that there's a place for conflict and you come in and say, hey, there's a way that I can help you reduce those conflicts and you can be able to manage the herds differently?
So that's a really good question, John. And in the beginning, as you can imagine, there's maybe a lot of kickback to me coming on the landscape. I'm a new person. I'm not, I wasn't born here. So it was kind of like, well, what's this guy doing out here? I think after, I've been doing this for just south of a decade now. And in the beginning, it probably took me 3 years to even get permission to even move cattle in any manner whatsoever. So I think the core foundation block of that was definitely trust. And that was established by me just being out there. So you can't deny that somebody wants to help you when they're out there every day, whether it's snow, sleet, rain, 100 degrees, smoke is the new norm out here in the summer. People they just respect that. And the ranching community members that I work with are really wanting solutions. There's a lot of folks that just don't want solutions and don't want range ready to work. And that's part of that extreme bell curve that I tend to kind of trend not to utilize, not to even focus on, because you can get lost in those extreme ends of that spectrum, as you can imagine. So one thing that I've noticed, and that goes on both ends, right? There's environmentalists that have come out here and shot cattle thinking that's going to help get cattle off the landscape. And really, they've just injured an animal. And now wolves are going to depredate upon that animal. And you might have started a process there inadvertently that directly impacts wolves. So again, those extreme ends you don't really deal with. So once I was out there just saying, hey, I'm out here every day. They see you when they wake up, they see that you're already up. When they're going to bed, they see you're out there. I've had ranchers come out and they're pick up and they're like, man, it's cold out here. And I'm on my horse and it's, like a blizzard condition. And I'm like, yeah, it is. So I think that builds trust, and that builds respect because they're like, wow, that guy's doing it. That's a legit old school profession with a different twist on it. That's the guy that's out there being a cowboy, but instead of just killing that wolf, he's actually trying to condition that wolf using diversion conditioning techniques. So in the beginning, really hard to do that. Now I think it's a little bit easier because they know that my motivation, the ones that I work with, is true and pure. And they're like, well, no, I trust him. He's a person that's doing a good job, and that he really wants this to be a successful thing for not just, wolves, but for me as well. And that was made clear real quick to me. Again, sorry about the tangent there, guys, but I'm getting your answer, man. I'm getting your answer. So
no, it's all good.
But it was made clear to me in the beginning. Like, I came over here initially with kind of a naive viewpoint, and I don't mean that negatively towards me, just like I wanted to help save wolves. And then I was like, wow, I'm going to have to actually help save this culture as well because of what's happening, and kind of some of the stances that some folks take on this are very anti-wolf, and that's not helping the culture really regain its nobility in the eyes of the public. So in the beginning, kind of hard, as you can imagine, like I was saying. Now it's a little different. And so when we're talking about like moving animals in like conjunction with like grazing management tactics, one thing that I've told folks, which is actually really a neat byproduct of that, is we're actually helping those herds utilize their natural defensive mechanisms by doing the same thing that we're trying to do to keep those herds in a more like grouped manner and move over the landscape in a way that doesn't overgraze or doesn't overstay their welcome in certain zones. So I think that was really helpful just to breach that topic. And that was something that first you got to get your foot in the door, so to speak, and you got to meet the people that really want to work with you and do a good job. And I think that just builds that rapport, and then it goes off of that. So these are long answers. Sorry, guys. Hopefully they're not too long.
No, you're good. You're good.
From the perspective of a guy who's in the mix in such a tangible way, what do you think makes domestic? And I think you were sort of answering it on the tail end of that last piece there, but what makes domestic free-ranging cows so susceptible to predation?
So that's a really good question too. You guys got good questions. Thanks, dude. So what makes them susceptible to predation, I think, is cattle aren't native to the forests out here. It's not a native species. They're not nearly as nimble as like an elk or a deer. They don't have, generally speaking, they don't have antlers to protect themselves. But the main thing is so wild animals, wild ungulates, which is just a hoofed mammal, like deer and elk and moose, they're a wild animal. So they're very adapted at navigating that terrain, being predator savvy, utilizing their natural defensive mechanisms to defend themselves in a manner that's really, really effective. Actually, we've seen in like cases in Yellowstone, like, when an elk turns around and faces that pack of wolves, a lot of the times that pack of wolves goes, nah, that's just too much risk to what I might possibly gain. And that's something that maybe we'll talk about later, is risk to gain. Well, I guess this is a good place to talk about it. So wild animals are masters of risk to gain. So they basically look at any scenario, whether it's like, I got to walk down that hill to go get a drink of water from that creek. Like, okay, that's my gain as I get my water intake for the day. What do I have to risk? Okay, so maybe I should do this at a different time that predators aren't active, or maybe I should do this, and not when there's a busy, traffic section here. So they have to constantly stack up, like, what am I getting from this and what am I risking? So when you look at cattle on the landscape, not really able to defend themselves in the means of like a natural ungulate on that landscape, that stacks that gain up and lowers that risk. So, and then when you add in the fact that normal practice for a long time has been to put cattle out in, let's say, June and bring them back in October without much ability to check on them. And I don't mean that they're not going in there. I mean, ranchers will go in there and put salt in, but very rarely do they see all their cattle, even in that whole season, let alone, let's say, even in a week. So what that does is that leaves a lot of loophole time, basically. Wolves, again, we'll talk about wolves specifically, I guess. Sorry if I keep going off on that. It's just, it does work for other animals. But wolves are really good at finding patterns and the weak spots in those patterns. I mean, even in how they hunt, they'll flush a herd, try and find a weak or sick or injured animal and go for that animal. So that's like a pattern right there. They flush that herd, they find out who's able to be separated with ease, or at least more ease. It's still pretty hard to run after them, I'm sure, but find out how they can increase that gain and lower that risk. So right there's a perfect example. The effect is called the sanitation effect, when they're pulling animals that are maybe sick or injured from the herd and hunting like that. So when you look at domestic cattle on a landscape, that really, I mean, when you see some of these forests, they're really thick, and these cattle aren't really, they're pretty big, and they're kind of cumbersome when they move through the woods. Even though cattle can be fast and defend themselves, in certain scenarios, it really diminishes their ability to adequately defend themselves with the tools at hand for them. So it just kind of makes the wolves go, well, heck, there's nobody up here. I mean, watching them, so I might as well. And what happens is, once it's a learned behavior, it's a much harder process to react to than to guide. It's much easier as a proactive measure, non-lethal implementation. Than it's kind of like training your dog after he's had a year getting in the trash can, like no trash can, versus like you don't come in the kitchen in the first place, if that makes sense. So
yeah, no, it does. Yeah.
How much of these disadvantages that you're describing here were bred into these cows through domestication, and how much of it is just the species?
Yeah, totally. So I'd say a little bit of both, I guess. So in portions of North America, it's really prime cattle grazing areas. You're like, well, that's an open field. That's like where you imagine cattle will be. And I could show you pictures of mountainous areas where these ranchers are kind of, quote unquote, basically that's what they have to graze upon, not forest, but that's their options. So, which interdispersed meadows are much different in terrain as arduous as that versus, open flatland. Like, for instance, and I'll answer your question, but this is just an example. When I went to a range riding seminar in Montana, and I was talking to the host, and they're like, all right, we're going to go to some thick forest, and we're going to kind of give you a rundown on the landscape. And we get to that location, and I had a gentleman that was working with me at the time, and my buddy's like taps me. He's like, so when are we getting to the thick forest? And I was like, I don't know. I think we're in it, actually, man. And it was like a very like park-like setting. I mean, trees, 30, 40 feet, maybe 50 plus apart, with no understory. So then you come over here, and he's like, he was at that time a new rider with me, and he's like, well, I think I could range ride from a hot tub with my beer in my hand, just looking out on the landscape. I can see almost all the cattle. So that's a huge detail and variable there that I think should be accounted for. Like, it's just not as easy to graze up here as it is in some other locations in North America. So with that being said, I think the species, like you said, we're trying to, selectively breed animals for reasons that are obviously advantageous for the rancher, bigger weight, easier, more docile, things like that is what we're looking for. But in that process, I think you might be right there, Stephen, is how you put that, is we've kind of almost inadvertently bred like the wild protective characteristics that keep their wild cousin ungulates safe, or more safe in many ways. So I would say it's definitely doable, but practices definitely have to be augmented once this apex predator is back in the landscape, I think. And instead of going like, I'm just going to go status quo and hope that nothing changes. That's the problem that we keep seeing wolves, at least in my state of Washington, killed for, is that there really hasn't been that quality effort of actual range riding. There's a lot of loopholes still, even if it's just gaps in time. So does that kind of make sense?
Right. Yeah. To piggybacking off of what Steven said, since he spoke about the cattle and the wildlife section of it, what about the individuals and the small business cattle ranching that have gotten used to this type of non-predators on the landscape for a good portion of the last 80, 90 years, up until wolves sort of got reintroduced and started coming back? Are they not willing to shift and work? I know you said at the beginning that there's individuals and ranchers that are working with you on these non-lethal methods, but is there also sort of a bred out of and again, I'm not a rancher, so I don't know, but bred out of those practices themselves in keeping with looking after your cattle and making sure instead of just letting them go and say, okay, I'll come back in 4 months, and correct me if I'm wrong in any way, shape, or form. And I'm not lowering, saying anything negative about the ranching community. I'm just stating is that as with the cows or the cattle, do we see those practices sort of being more lackadaisical and not willing to go back to the way that they used to be, say, maybe 100, 150 years ago?
I think to answer your question, what I'm trying to, or what I hear you're saying or questioning is, yes, I think a lot of ranchers are just, there's a lot of the community out here that just don't want wolves present. That's just made evident in their actions and their statements. And that's just, it's not the most productive way for them because that's just not going to get them where they want. Wolves are going to be here. They're here to stay. Like just for instance, in Washington State, I mean, they did a poll and 70% of Washingtonians want wolves and the other 30 don't. And those 70% live on the west side and the 30 that don't live on the east side. And the east side has the wolves and the cattle and the west side has the money to deal with it. So it's like a really tricky kind of slippery slope there. But so a lot of people that I've worked with that I continue to work with see that logic. They're like, well, they're not here. I mean, they're here to stay. They're not going to leave. I have to adapt my tactics or I will lose my business. It will go under. It will just be a way of the past. And the whole, let me just grab my rifle and shoot that wolf mentality just doesn't work anymore as well. I mean, we do obviously have poaching cases and whatnot, but it's not the most efficient way for the ranching community to better change and adapt to the environment that's happening in front of them. And that's the part that's frustrating. I mean, I've heard a lot of ranchers that I work with say, don't those folks know how hard they're making it for us by doing that? And that's a frustrating part. So, and to touch bases a little bit on that, some of it's just perception too, which you can't blame them. A lot of the ranching community up here, wolves being on the landscape is much different than like people that love wolves and maybe are living in the Seattle or more urban areas. It's like I live, that was one of the reasons why I moved out here. I didn't want to just be like, well, you should just change your practices and live different. It's like, well, have you been out there and have you lived like that? Well, at that time I haven't, I hadn't. And I was like, well, then you should probably go out there and live and kind of put your money where your mouth is, so to speak. You can't just throw stones at somebody and expect any kind of positive change to happen unless you're going to try and put yourselves in their shoes. So instead of just theoretically doing that, I moved here. I started raising sheep as sustenance farming. I raise other forms of animals for just consumption for me. So there's a lot of reasons for that, just to kind of digress on that a little bit. But I think there's a divorce where our meat comes from too. So I think that I'm trying to get closer to the root of all these subjects, for me at least personally. So and I don't want to digress on that too much, but so I think a lot of the ranch community is willing and wants solutions. And I've heard people go from, I don't like wolves, or maybe wolves are, the only good wolf is a dead wolf. I haven't really heard that with most folks that I work with, but I've heard a lot of sentiment that says, I don't really like them. They're obviously going to affect my livelihood. I'm really scared of that. And it's like, well, I understand that. And fear-based reactions are not what we want to base giant decisions off of. So let's try and figure out a better way to make you not feel like that. I don't want you to feel like that, because then we'll never actually be able to focus on bringing solutions to the table. So those members of the ranch community, I think, are like super refreshing to work with, super stoked to be able to have met those folks, call them friends now. And those folks have gone from that mentality to, well, I like the wolves that are here now because they're not messing with my cattle. And it's like, I don't want those wolves gone. So that's really rewarding for me in that sense. So, and you're always, again, going to have those ends of the extreme populations. And a lot of people just aren't really, going to want wolves. There's no changing those minds necessarily. So I think the best way to get a kind of work around that is just to empower the folks that do want this to work and make it a positive thing for them. And then maybe their neighbors will share that sentiment down the road and say, well, I guess, it's not that bad of a thing having wolves in the landscape when done right, and when range riding's applied right, or when there's a service that is offered that can actually do some conflict mitigation, techniques. So, and that's a whole other problem because there really isn't that. A lot of what our State Department does is react to situations instead of try and guide them, which then kind of just inflames the public in a way that really lowers their social tolerance. So they're becoming less tolerant of wolves being on a landscape because they feel like they're being left hanging out to dry to deal with this problem by themselves. And then what that does is that lowers social tolerance on the other end of the spectrum by environmentalists going, well, if they're not going to try, then we don't want them on public land. That's kind of the start of the rain war, which we're seeing right now. So I think I kind of digressed from your question there,
John. No, it's good. But I want to, if I can interject just for a second, because you're saying, well, you are the epitome of what Stephen and I have been talking about more so lately than not, is the radical middle, because you, unlike what you just said with the State Department and a lot of the Fish and Wildlife, where it's that knee-jerk emotional reaction, be it one side or the other, you come in and really try to bring both of these sides together. Maybe not like you said, the polar opposites, the extremes, where on either side, they're probably not going to change their viewpoint, whether it be pro-wolf, anti-wolf in the extreme. But what you're doing is beautiful in that it's a measured approach. And I think a lot of that is missing. And that's a lot of the conversations that we've had, is that measured approach that let's find solutions really don't get to the table because the emotional end of it really ramps up and it gets people agitated one way or the other. So how are you able to bring that sort of middle ground into this? Because you've said a lot of wonderful things, but what kind of frustration does that for you as a small business owner in your own right, trying to build these coexistence measures when you see the state itself taking such extreme measures either one way or the other and really, basically placing a bomb in the middle of it and just having it blow open?
Yeah. Well, in a nutshell, it's extremely frustrating. It's extremely, it can become depressing if not, if just left to its own devices. It's really, sometimes I feel like I'm on the losing side of like a David and Goliath battle, because when you do have such like a strong entity like the state, it's hard to really bring those solutions to the table when you have such an opposing force behind the other opposition, if that makes any sense. So it's difficult. I had somebody ask me that a couple of weeks ago. They're like, I think I would just be sitting here screaming at this tree all day, and you have this leveled approach. How do you do that? And I was like, I don't really, I don't know, except for trying to find like a point of understanding in everybody that I'm dealing with. But yeah, there's definitely a toll, and kind of probably the highest point of that I've seen in my career path of at least this portion of working with wolves. And that's just because there's like, it feels like the tide's going the opposite direction sometimes. So one thing that helps me in that is to go back to those individuals that we've made incredible headway and incredible progress with, and just have a conversation with, and to view that conversation, like view that first memory of having with them and seeing where we're at now and seeing the amount of progression. Maybe it's at a rate much slower than what I'd ideally want, but there has been some progression made. So it's that kind of recharges the batteries. I've been trying to, I don't know, I think I might be getting off the topic here on your answer, but just been trying to like take more time for myself and trying to compartmentalize a little bit more, because I've for so long just soaked in everything and just, don't take time off. Just go ahead and work if that needs it. And it's like, well, that I can feel the batteries kind of dwindling on that, because there is such an opposing force on the other side. So, and that other force is really well organized and really well funded. And that's a huge problem just in regards to like running a small business that does this. It's completely dependent on funding. I end up volunteering numerous hours, which has always been something that I'm honored to do and proud to do, and willing to suffer. I don't see my home that I, pay a mortgage on for most of the summer. So, and a lot of times in other portions of the year, like I'm out there in the winter a lot. So, a lot of the comforts of being, in modern civilization are just not known to me. So those were always something that I was more than willing and happy to sacrifice. But now that I see like that tide is going the other direction, I see in me like definitely it's becoming harder to do that. Just because you're like, well, is this, is it a losing battle? And I don't think it is. And in my heart of heart, I don't believe that. And I think I have to remind myself that there's other people out here, even as this conversation with you guys, like, which I really appreciate, just helping get the positive messages out there is a huge thing right there, because then you get feedback from people that might not even known this issue was even happening, let alone like the depth and the magnitude and the actual gravity of what's going on with how like we are choosing to manage wildlife in the United States of America, and how that might negatively affect cultures, and how there is a positive way to address this. So that's one thing that I also need to realize. Like lately, there's been some things that have been like, what am I trying to say, that have impeded me on doing my job to the fullest. And it's something that's really frustrating. And things like you just said, like the state actually, reacting to this instead of guiding it. There's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that I won't even, I won't dump on you. But there's a lot of stuff that's happening, and it's really frustrating. And one thing that really helps me bring it back to the center is like, but it is possible. And that's one thing that really I hold on to, like a life raft in an ocean without land sometimes, like, but it is possible and it is happening. Very small scale. I'd love to see it upscale. I'd love to see Washington be kind of like the pinnacle of how we could manage wildlife in a consistent manner that is not only beneficial to the wildlife that like our state management agencies are mandated to do, but like it's better for the actual environment, and it's better for the cultures that these wild animals live in. And I know that's possible. So that's one thing that brings me back to that. I don't know if I really answered that, John. I might have gone on to a little bit of an in-depth philosophical.
Well, when Idaho and when the Wisconsin, Idaho, Montana bills started to pass, and the wolf hunting became so aggressive, I just had a feeling that they overdid it, and that it was going to prompt some emergency response. And I think as of, just for our listeners too, but I think as of yesterday, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced that wolves in the West may warrant protection under the ESA. And there was an emergency petition from the Center of Biological Diversity, the Humane Society of the United States, Humane Society Legislative Fund, and the Sierra Club. So we might see some changes. How would that affect your future?
So, I mean, if it does go back to federal protection, it would take that off of the state's hands a little bit in ways, in certain geographic portions of the state, but it won't dramatically change what's happening here. But I guess that does kind of put me into a position to talk to you about something else, I guess, that somebody just talked to me about the other day. We were talking about, the fact that, Wisconsin, Idaho, Montana, they're calling 90% of their wolves. And the person that was on the other line said, where did we go wrong? Like, what do we do wrong there? Like we recovered the animal to a point, and now we're just like, just devastate them. And I went, and my only answer was, we never address the actual problem. Because at the end of the day, wolves in landscape and cows in landscape are not an actual choice of one or the other. It's not, can we have wolves or can we have cows? You can have both. So what it comes down to is, well, why are we having trouble? Well, we're having trouble because this is a problem not originated with wolves eating cattle. We have a problem with human disconnect. And it goes back to a human variable is the actual problem. And that was my only answer to her for that question of, where did we go wrong? Why are we now just going to go and extirpate the wolves again? I mean, this is what we did in the 1930s almost, with a little bit more, leniency now. We're not just going and eradicating every wolf, but 90% of the population is a pretty strong, like you said, reaction to, hey, it's in state management's hands. Let's just wipe them off the friggin' state. We'll have one pack that we can easily manage. And it's like, well, I think what to me is we never address that problem. We never perceive value to have wolves in the landscape for people that actually live with wolves. That makes sense. So that's one thing that I'm trying to do now is not just help people survive and coexist, it's like we can actually thrive in the landscape by having wolves. A ranching community can actually thrive by having wolves in the landscape. And there's different avenues that I'm trying to help with that. But if you do that, and you actually make it a positive addition to their life instead of maybe like the actual thing that crumbles their whole existence as a rancher, you've actually empowered them to see value in having this iconic animal on their landscape again. So who will protect them? Those people that they're being most potentially affected by that animal. And that's the crux. And that's where I'm like, I think Washington can do it. So, I mean, when you look at it, like we recovered animals in those states that you just mentioned, but the sentiment was still primarily like, we don't want them here. We're just being forced to have them. And nobody took time to educate the importance of having them just like ecologically, or maybe like monetarily, or any of the angles that you want to take to actually reach a person's kind of their core. We never addressed any of those, I don't think. So, and I say that I wasn't any part of that. So, I mean, obviously there's a lot of ignorance on my level of what was addressed there, but clearly that wasn't, I don't think, at least adequately addressed. And that's something that I'd like to see in Washington have happen. So I don't think it'll see a dramatic difference in like how it affects my on the ground job, so to speak. I mean, shoot, COVID didn't affect it affected numerous people's jobs. People were like, well, how did COVID affect you? And I was like, I'm out there by myself in the woods anyways, and this is a necessary job. I mean, even though all jobs are necessary for people. So I don't think that will be a huge negative impact. I think it might, yeah, I don't know what that'll do. It'll be interesting because it goes back to, this is a human issue, I think, and we're dealing a lot with social tolerance. So if you see protection be thrown back on, it might upset the rural community without actually, if no, you got to think of it from their point of view. Like, we're protecting what might be affecting them negatively, but they feel, a lot of these guys, that nobody's helping protect their livelihood. So if you can actually protect their livelihood, help them appreciate wolves in the landscape, kind of solve the whole scenario and really develop the foundation that you can work from for future generations to have both livestock producing communities and wolf-rich environments. So,
right. Yeah. Everything you said there is,
I don't know. Did I answer that, Stephen? Or?
No, you did. No, you did.
Yeah.
You know, you're, as much as you think your tangents don't carry weight, they do. Your tangents are incredible. And you're saying so many poignant things in that we have gone away from this social tolerance, and a lot of the individuals that we've spoken to, whether they're biologists, whether they're former hunters, or they still hunt now, is the West, Stephen puts it really well, is the West still is this gateway to the wilderness. I mean, anything west of the Rocky Mountains, if people want to go see wildlife, whether it's bears or cougars or eagles or bison or whatever it may be, that's the place that these ranching communities, because of the amount of land that they have, they are really the stewards of these wild places. And I'm taking that from Stephen. But these are the conversations that we continue to have, is that, like you say, it comes down to, if both sides are not at the table and voices are able to be heard on the issues that are affecting them, the issues that are affecting the ecological impacts, the monetary impacts, we're never going to get to a point where like you said, we're going to be able to coexist and be able to deal with. It shouldn't be a problem. There should be this coexistence that should have been happening from the get-go. And us as humans, unfortunately, we deal with things in an irrational and emotional way.
Yeah, it is getting mildly exhausting, I guess, to see these polls always being communicated these last few years. And this wolf topic it's a great metaphor for the recent past, these extreme shifts. You know, first it's kill all of them, and then it's special protections. I think there has to be a point where we realize this way of governing just doesn't work, and it breeds resentment, and it breeds retaliation and illogical hate between groups of people who live differently, which just furthers that separation. And I think, coexistence with each other, not just wolves, has to be found politically and socially. There has to be some balance, because the reality is the government works for all of us, or at least it's supposed to. It's supposed to find compromises because people are different and need different things and live different lives. And I think this is one scenario where we actually can find a sweet spot. There really has to be a reality in which ranchers and the rural community have ways of sensibly managing wolves and have the power to manage how wolves directly affect their lives and their livelihoods, and that, and that the rest of the population, even those who don't live near wolves, who want to see wolves on the landscape, don't have to all of a sudden accept 90% of a population being decimated after thousands of years of evolving with our species, and after we paid for this expensive conservation success journey, and the species has sort of settled in the hearts of so many for good reason. That has to be a factor because it is human. We just don't understand each other very much anymore. And urban communities and rural communities are so separated from each other, but they both benefit from each other. So I think there has to be a balance, a compromise that exists.
No, I completely agree. And you guys both put that in a really good form. I think, it kind of goes back to what we were just talking about before that is, if you empowered that community to see the value of that animal in the first place, I think you would see way less aggressive hunting, potential projected numbers. I mean, that to me is really telling of a community that never wanted them, never saw value, only saw the negative impacts that they might have, which means that they never probably found the solutions to actually coexist. And then beyond that to thrive. So there's continued problems. So really it just helped foster that kind of hate mongering, for lack of a better term, for that animal. And then also it goes back to the other side, and the environmentalists are going, well, yeah, we can't stand this, and it's like, well, now we can't stand those people anymore. And it's like, really, there's just no balanced approach there. And I think if maybe we tried to do that in the beginning, even on a small scale, of just like, what do you need? How does it affect you? And how can we make this better to where you see the value of it? I think you'd see way less interest in hunting, because I mean, those are projected numbers, but there's already a huge interest. There's already, prevalent poaching going on. So it's something that I think is another underlying fundamental thing that isn't being addressed necessarily. And that's that connection. That's that bridging of those two ends of the spectrum, so to speak, which is hard when either end is it's a polarizing subject. That's again why just focus on the middle of the bell and try and build a bridge, and then try and basically make the anti-activism on either side less heard, and empower the people that want it to go in a positive manner. Like bring them to the table, bring the solutions there, and let those voices be heard. And that'll diminish the volume, of these other guys that are just screaming, get the ranchers off or get the wolves off. So I agree with you guys there. So.
No, you're there. Do you think, and I'm going backwards just for a moment, do you think your experience when you were at Wolf Haven International had the effect, the effect in that you were able to use the tools and use the knowledge that you had there to start G.R.I.P.H and be able to have the unique perspective of both sides from the jump? Do you think that was an absolute help for you in the beginning when you started this whole thing?
Yeah, I think it was. I think being there actually didn't, oddly enough, foster a understanding of the other end of the spectrum, the other side of the coin for me. It actually, if full disclosure, when I was, probably 20, 21, I was just like, well, yeah, I was doing the exact same thing from a very naive and ignorant standpoint of other people that are doing the same thing currently today, going, well, just if you get the ranchers off the land, it seems like that's the best thing, and I'm doing that while eating a damn steak. And I'm like, well, this doesn't make any sense, Daniel. This doesn't compute at all. So granted, that meat, was from probably a different country because of how our meat system works. So yeah, I think it actually, in the beginning, it inspired me. I think what I brought from Wolf Haven is the skills to start G.R.I.P.H. Yeah, definitely concur with that. That helped me dramatically, just knowing wolf behavior for a decade. gave me a jump start on how I could help out in the bigger picture on this open landscape. So, but, I just really, I moved over here, honestly. I was like, I wanted to save wolves. I wanted to help wolves. And then like I said earlier, I think, I quickly realized, like, well, I also learned to love this culture, learned to love the people in this culture that I call friends. I mean, obviously there's some people that my viewpoints don't coincide with, to say the least. So, but there's a lot of folks out here that I learned a tremendous amount, have so much respect for. And so that jump kind of was like basically bolstered when I got here, for lack of a better term. Well, I wouldn't use bolster. That jump was made possible by my love for wolves, and then the ability that I'm doing right, or the effect that I'm having right now on the landscape, or with individuals, or maybe the few wolves that I've helped save over the years. That's been fostered by a general balanced outlook on the importance of both. If that answers your question, Stephen.
No, I think everything that it's incredible because you chose to dive right into this, and it's again, all the kudos to you from coming from a pro wolf side to now really moving yourself into the center, in the middle, which I think it would be difficult for a lot of individuals, but you had the open mind and the presence of mind to start something and understand that. I think if more people took the approach, as you said probably a few minutes ago, if the rural side and the city side were able to almost switch places and understand the perspective of where they're all coming from, I think we would all be in a better place. Because, not saying that you came from the city, but you came from the pro side and then moved into an somewhat anti-wolf place, and were able to cultivate that into a situation where I can help both sides, again, come into the middle and see and have the social tolerance and make sure and understand the knowledge that I have of wolves, and then the knowledge that I'm gaining from the ranching community as to how things actually work, that this is a place that can have coexistence on top of itself. So I think that in and of itself is a huge leap of faith by you, and it's worked out beautifully, like you said, for almost a decade.
Yeah, that's a really it was a heck of a leap, I'll tell you. Didn't even see the landing kind of leap, but yeah, I think that's one thing that I believe that our world currently suffers from in numerous ways. I mean, and that's something that I think if people took an approach like that, I'm not saying like, oh, do what I do. I'm just like, that for me was what I felt at that time I needed to do. And then to keep an open mind when I'm over here, because I don't know what it's like to live with wolves. I mean, I lived on the property, had a wolf sanctuary, with 63 wolves that I heard every day, but took care of them. But that's completely different when you're like walking outside your backyard to go barbecue and your neighbor is a gray wolf staring at you. You're like, oh, wow. Okay. That's different. So I think if we all took a little bit more time to maybe, instead of just throw accusations or make snap judgments and say, well, why? I mean, obviously there's certain lines that when crossed, I don't think, like certain things are just really bad to do. So I don't think there's much that we can learn from that. I mean, not to say that we can't learn from that. I digress too much from that. But I think in most situations, we can all benefit from really trying to be compassionate and be maybe a little bit more open-minded and take the time to really think about what somebody's life is like, maybe. And I think that's it's worked out for me in some sense, and it's been difficult in others. I mean, definitely like small business. My brother every year is like, you need to quit doing that. You're running a red business. And I was like, I know, man, but I believe it works and I've got a passion about it. So he's like, I know, man, but you're a business owner. You got to think like this, So it's like, well, you're right. But I do believe that there's a path forward here still. So for me, yeah, it was just the best way that I could really do something. And I think when people, everything's connected. I guess it comes back down to everything's connected in a way that a lot of us don't see. Like even in that simple scenario that I told you about when I was feeling like kicking ranchers off the public land while eating a steak. It's like a lot of people do that. A lot of people are divorced from where they're even food, where their actual food comes from. So I think if we can bridge the gap on any of these levels, it benefits the whole. So I think wolves are a species of animals that really, throughout our timeline on especially, let's just talk about U.S. Like they used to be in every state except for Hawaii, and we completely decimated that population. I mean, we extirpated them from 95% of their home range, and then barely just didn't totally bring them off the table entirely in the U.S. So I think that right there says something in the effect of how we're similar. So I guess this is something that I should share from my point of view. Like, we're very similar to wolves, and I think it's a human trait. When you see something that you don't like in somebody else, half the time it's because it's in you and you don't know how to deal with it in yourself. You're like, oh, it's crappy that person interrupts people, and you're like, well, that's because I do it and I don't like it. I think wolves definitely exhibit some of that. I mean, they're highly intelligent. They're very gregarious. They run in a social hierarchy. They're very adaptive to their environment, and they're really widespread. So I think that was kind of a potential for this to come down the pipe. Anyways, we all have dogs. You can see them in the background. See the camera. I mean, these are all, I have dogs. I've had ranchers complain about the presence of wolves in landscape while they have an overabundance of elk and they have a cattle dog next to them. And I'm like, what was crazy is that wolves could help you with your overabundance of elk, and your dogs came from the wolves everything's connected in a sense that if you really take more time to, instead of just pulling a string without seeing what it does to anything else, maybe take time to see what that's actually doing to the rest of it. So that kind of, I don't know if I answered your question there.
No, I think you said it beautifully, actually. And that's a lot of what we talk about at Wolf Connection too. It's really like looking into a mirror. I mean, Stephen and I both had situations, and I'm sure you had it at Wolf Haven and probably even more so now, is that when you see a wolf in any situation, whether it be in captivity or especially in the wild, there is something there that we, I think, as human beings have either lost or are searching for, or see something that, like you just stated wonderfully, is that we don't like in our own self. And so we tend to put those things on a being, a species, an animal, whatever it may be, and say, well, that needs to go because of X reason. And that's something, unfortunately, I think that we don't tap into enough as to how we can help ourselves by learning from these other species, whether whatever species it may be. It doesn't necessarily have to be the wolf, but the wolf has been, for whatever the reason, and we've gone through this for however many episodes of why this particular species, this particular animal just resonates so deeply with so many people on so many different levels, as opposed to any other animal on the planet. I mean, we don't see this with whales or dolphins or tigers or bears, in any way, shape, or form. It really just comes down to the wolf and why it just resonates so deeply with everyone.
That's an interesting topic in itself, I think, right there. I think it's such an iconic animal in so many ways, whether you look at it from a multi-generational ranching perspective that says that's an iconic animal that didn't even let us start our livestock production industry. We had to really go after it very aggressively to remove it from the landscape, primarily so that we could safely raise these animals, and then now that that apex predator is back in the landscape, I think it really pulls on them to go, well, man, my grandpa's grandpa got rid of them, for a reason. And that's something that was made evident to me before at Wolf Haven after a tour that I did. There was a gentleman that came up, and a lot of people liked my tours, except for my coworkers hated them because I'd always go over because people were willing to learn. I would just be like, well, we're going to stand here for an extra 15 minutes and talk. And they would always get upset with me. But I was like, it's worth it. I thought our whole mission is to educate. And That's the biggest blade against ignorance. So, anyways, this gentleman came up to me after that tour and he said, that was a wonderful talk, young man. But I think you need to realize something that you're doing that's kind of offensive that I don't even think you're aware of. And I was like, well, please, educate me. And he said, you're telling me that what I'm doing might be wrong. And at that time, that's more of an approach and an angle that I took, which wasn't the best way to facilitate change or to help understand somebody else's point of view, but just saying what you're doing is wrong. And maybe there was some merit to that, but I didn't really know why they were doing it like that in the first place. But anyways, he said, I understand now from what you've told me and what you've educated me today dramatically. And I see the logic that you're coming from, but you got to realize you're telling me that not only am I doing it wrong, my dad was doing it wrong, my dad's dad was doing it wrong, and his dad's dad, you're telling multiple generations of my family that we were doing it wrong. And I was like, that's a beautiful concept that really has helped me understand again, like, hey, there's some generationally ingrained mentality on everyone that, we need to kind of be careful with and be conscientious of it and really respect, I think, because to say that what they did back then was wrong, I mean, I believe it was. There was a better solution, I think, than just, wiping the animals off the landscape in order to raise livestock in the West here. But my whole point is it's hard to say that when maybe that's all they knew. It's not that they did anything wrong. They were just like, well, this is all I know how to do. That eats my cow. I don't know how to keep it from eating my cow unless it's dead. So that's something that I think is not a viable reason to continue status quo now anymore, because we do have some ideas and we do have some, definitely productive things that are producing results in a manner that would help massively increase coexistence and then move to the next step of thriving. So, and on the other hand, well, man, I kind of went off a tangent and forgot the origin of the question there. So I wanted to say something else about the other side. Well, maybe it'll come to me here.
It's okay. No, it was just a thought. I mean, it's, also before, I would be, it is and you've, like I said, all your experiences too, I think are hugely informative, I think, for a lot of people. Myself, I give tours too at Wolf Connection. So I think it's always good to hear I'm always open to the knowledge and I always want to hear the other side. And as long as it's I want to hear those conversations and I want to hear those thoughts, because without them, sometimes it can lean one way or the other. And I try not to do that. So it's good on you to accept that and to let that individual speak, his mind and really for him to open his mind on the other side as well, that's a beautiful moment. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about G.R.I.P.H because G.R.I.P.H started, is the name of your company, but G.R.I.P.H is just tell us about the connection that you and G.R.I.P.H have, because was he with you with Wolf Haven International? Did you get G.R.I.P.H before you started your business? What was the influence like and the relationship that you have with G.R.I.P.H throughout this whole process, and how is he or she? I don't want to.
It's a he.
Okay.
G.R.I.P.H's a boy. No, not a problem. Love to share that. Let me. I did remember what I was going to say, John. If it's all right, if I backtrack just a second.
Go ahead.
So how iconic the symbol that it was. I was talking about ranchers' perspective and how they had extirpated that animal from the scene. Like the other side of the situation deals with a lot of people that see the wolf as an iconic symbol of what it means to have a wild environment, what it means to have nature in a whole, basically in a healthy ecosystem. And I think that's something that is super important to look at too, because I've talked to ranchers and they're like, I don't get why people even love wolves so much. They don't live with them. Why do they even like them? And it's like, because it represents a wild place. And in our hearts, I think we all like visiting wild places. And it's something that, I've had ranchers experience. I've been there with ranchers when they hear wolves for the first time. And you cannot help but smile when they're awed by the beauty of that sound caressing the forest. They're like, wow, that was amazing. Oh yeah, my cows are out here. And they're like, so I think it kind of speaks to that more, I guess, for lack of a better term, the primal aspects in us, of how we like to go hiking, how we like to be on the woods, how we like to experience nature. It brings us right back to the kind of the source there. But yeah, I just wanted to mention a little bit on that other end of the coin there. But yeah, so G.R.I.P.H, he is an amazing spirit. The guy is just a great horse. I had a friend at Wolf Haven, an old timer buddy that was kind of housing a horse for another coworker of mine. And one day he's like, well, you should get a horse, and keep him here. And I was like, well, I don't think I want to do that. I've always wanted a horse that, I've always wanted horses. I never thought I'd have them. Like, my family grew up really poor. So the option was really exciting to have him bring that up to me. But I was like, I always wanted to have like a horse in my own yard. I just feel funny having an animal family member that's not near me and I have to go drive somewhere to make sure they're okay. So anyways, long story short, he shows me this, I was like, well, maybe I'll look for him sometime. And he ends up showing me a picture of this animal, and the G.R.I.P.H was actually destined to be slaughtered. He was on a website, Save Our Slaughterbound Equines. And so he was going to be turned into dog food in either Mexico or Canada. So it was kind of a really traumatic eye-opener to the horse world, because I never had horses when I was younger, like I mentioned. So it was really like, wow, we kill horses that we're just done with or something? Like, that makes no sense. And I mean, and that, opened up to other, like how we manage wild horses and how we actually call giant herds of wild horses because they're competitors for grazing. And that was really sad. I'm like, man, we utilize horses to build America, like that's kind of what this whole Western theme was built off of. And now we're just like, oh, we're done with you guys. So we're, now you're competing for what you helped us start, which is the livestock industry. We're going to kill you because we got ATVs and quads and stuff, and you're eating grass that these guys could. So it's a really crazy eye opener to that. So that became a whole other part of the mission of range riding, is to help save slaughter-bound equines and put them with range riders and find somebody that can, create a team that can go out there and actually hit the ground, hooves and boots, and make a difference. So, but my relationship with G.R.I.P.H, I guess, in a nutshell, is he's my brother, basically. And man, everybody's like, that's so cool that you rescued him. I was like, yeah, but he kind of rescued me at the end of the day. So I can't take all that credit and say that I did this and that. So, I mean, but yeah, in the beginning, I guess, when G.R.I.P.H and I moved up here, it was just him and I. We've now got 7 other horses with this. All except for one have been saved from slaughter. So that's been really a rewarding experience too, to help those guys get out of that system and then thrive and have a job and be a productive member of society. Basically, what am I trying to say? Basically, they're helping bring back something positive to society instead of just being shipped off to be dog food. But anyways, so yeah, I think in the beginning it was definitely like, he was my stalwart companion and all through all this. Didn't have anybody that I'd rode with. There was no other additional human presence with me. It was just him and I dealing with all these subjects, dealing with this subject and all its facets. So it was really, this would have never happened without him. And that's kind of in the beginning when I was like, I'll just range ride. I was like, basically I looked at what skills I had accumulated at my time at Wolf Haven and my time working in the veterinary medical profession. And I was like, well, that's, I got some niche skills. So these are going to be kind of hard to do anything with. And then I thought about the skills that G.R.I.P.H had taught me and with horsemanship. And I just kind of married those two together. And that's where range riding came into my head. And then that's when, I kind of went down that path that we spoke over earlier, is just developing this business. So he's been a stalwart companion. He's, really the brains of the operation, I believe, sometimes, because I get muddled in how politics affect everything and pseudoscience affects everything. And he just keeps his eye on the ball of the mission and the job at hand, which is nice. So super smart horse. I just can't even fathom why he ever even was potentially going to go down that path of being slaughtered. I mean, he's incredibly smart. He's incredibly athletic. These guys are doing like giant day trips of like 20 miles a day, easy. And then the next day do it again. So, I mean, incredibly fit, just an amazing horse that I am honored to be able to call my brother and part of my family. So, really interesting story on the website of how that all originated. It's kind of probably too long to get into real quick, but I was volunteering some time at a horse sanctuary when I was working with wolves on the west side, and it's a pretty interesting read. But yeah, Griff, I found that picture. So long story short, I guess I found that picture, and my buddy Jim had showed me, and he's like, "What about this horse?" And I was like, "Oh, that's him." He's like, "Well, you want to keep looking?" I was like, "No, I want that horse. If you're still okay with me keeping him here, I would love to do that." And he goes, "Okay, yeah, let's do it." So by the time I was ready to get that horse disappeared off the Save Our Slaughterbound Equine site. I couldn't get a hold of him, and the horse was gone. And just real short version, that the woman that I was doing that work for at that sanctuary said, "Hey, Daniel, I rescued a horse that might be good for you." And it was that horse. It was Griff. It was just really a full circle kind of experience. I was like, "What do you mean?" I was like, "No, I was like, Jerry, I already have a horse. I can't be looking for that horse." She's like, "Well, what horse are you looking at?" And I was like, "A gray one, and his name was this and that." And she's like, "Oh, that's the horse that I have." So it was really an amazing experience, and just kind of showed me that I'm, right where I need to be amongst the other things. So, but yeah, he's a really special guy that this just wouldn't have been possible without him helping me in many ways. Just even sometimes just being a companion out in the forest, just somebody to, be able to hang out with, even though he doesn't speak to me. But, it's kind of nice sometimes. We don't do a lot of talking. So, but it's just refreshing to look over and see a friend there. So good guy. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
good
amazing.
Guy.
So Daniel, I have one last question for you. And then I want to, please, we're going to promote Griff and give everybody the information right before we go. But my question for you is, when you hear the word, yeah, of course, when you hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to your mind?
Man, boy, when I hear the word wolf, what is the thing that comes to my mind? I guess teacher, an option to be better, I guess. Native Americans used to look at wolves as like actually a teacher for how they could actually live on the landscape and not overhunt herds and move like them, and kind of basically rotate where they're staying. And I think that's something that we could use a little bit more of. I think we're in a place now where a lot of our actions are becoming evident that they're not sustainable for long term. So I think we need to start looking at like, how do we move forward? And I think wolves are one of the species, like you mentioned earlier, like we don't get this with orcas, we don't get this, and wolves are right there on the tippy top of that list of about 3 that force us to examine our own actions and what they're doing to our environment and what they're doing to ourselves and how we can actually maybe improve them. And I think that's hugely important, especially this day and age, especially just with the amount of disconnect that we all experience, even in just our daily lives. I mean, I've seen groups of friends sitting at tables while not talking to each other on Facebook, and it's like, wow, it's a weird time to be alive in. I mean, we have more access to any information, and we're more kind of opinionated than any time other, and we're more disconnected than any time other too. And I think it's a time now where, when you say the word wolf, it's like we can have a roundtable discussion, and I think it'll be about that animal. So, well, I mean, we're doing it right now, right?
Interesting that you brought up horses, and sort of how we should factor in their involvement in our success as a species, in how we manage them. People are so ready to be all science about these types of things, but the reality is we're humans, and there's something human about recognizing our respect for a species because of how they contributed to our success. And I think that we're talking about wolves. We evolved with this animal over thousands and thousands of years, and they were likely instrumental in our success as a species. And I think that can be factored in, as well. That's okay. That there's a sentimental value to why we want to keep wolves on the landscape in the same way that we want to keep horses.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think it's something that we tend to lose sight of, especially as human population grows and encroaches on available habitat. There's only going to lead to more potential conflict. So the more we can really realize that it's kind of like when I teach, especially, although this could be easily conveyed to adults in the same manner, but when I do like presentations for like schools or something, I use the analogy of like a Jenga. And, the Jenga game, you pull the wood blocks out because these guys are classified as a keystone species. And if you're familiar with that in the construction world, it's like the brick and the archway of bricks that keeps the arch together. And if you yank that brick out, the whole arch falls. So it's kind of a good analogy of like the rest of the bricks are the other pieces of the environment, and that keystone species has to be there. So it's not even a matter of like the sentiment necessarily, in my opinion, of like having them on the landscape. I think we're coming to a realization like each one of those bricks needs to be in place, or we won't have a landscape to even call our home or do our own activities on anymore. And that's something that I think is becoming more apparent in ways. But as we do that and we find that there's an importance for these animals, we need to not just totally say, well, it's almost the same thing that we're doing, right? Like ranching community and like the anti-wolf ranching community in general is like, well, they're affecting me negatively, delete it. It's like, well, that's the exact same sentiment on the other side is like, well, they're affecting the wolves negatively, delete it. It's like, no, if we just go about this like that, we're just going to have a really precarious Jenga tower at the end of this game, and it's going to fall. So we don't want that. So I think, that raw appeal to wolves is hard for people to understand that live with them. And I think it's just as hard for those people to understand the importance of that cultural, the magnitude there. So, yeah, I think that's a really cool way to put that, though, Stephen. It's something that I hope that will exponentially grow in the right direction, because we're still kind of trending in the wrong direction in many ways, at least in regards to wolves. I mean, we just talked about, Wisconsin, Idaho, and Montana completely calling 90% of the population. That's just telling like history is repeating itself in that sense. So we need to do something different to make a better foundation for the future of not just our children and our family, but the Earth's inhabitants and all that entails, So at the end of the day, we're all Earthlings, man. It's kind of a weird saying, but it's something that I like to remind myself of. Like, there's nothing that necessarily says that I'm more important than any of these guys that I'm, it's like we all have a place to fit. And I think that's important to realize. And just because you fit there doesn't mean something else can't. So we need to get past that one or the other, black and white. And it's like, that's not a healthy, productive way to go forward in this path it's taken. So,
well,
you guys got good questions. I still appreciate the time, and I thank you for really thinking about the subject, you guys. And it sounds like you've had some cool experiences with wolves. I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful that you guys are delving into here, because this is half the battle, I must say. I feel like I work in a vacuum a lot of times, and when it does come out, like a lot of people want to clam onto it for whatever reason. And I've never been one to ask for any recognition or anything, but I've gotten opportunities to speak more now, and I've noticed that it's odd who wants to jump on that bandwagon of like, coexistence, and how those words don't necessarily match their actions. And it's nice to see people that are out there trying to get the truth of what's happening on the ground out. So thank you for that. And thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely, Daniel. Thank you so much. Just quickly before you go, just give everyone out there your website, where they can contact you, where they can see the work that you're doing, so that they can really, really get a full grasp of everything that is you and G.R.I.P.H.
Well, thank you guys. So the website is imagine it's griffs.com, believe it or not.
Wow, that was a lucky
G.R.I.P.H.S.com. I know, man. I was like, I don't think they're going to guess this one. The website's griffs.com. That'll lead you. There's some links on there. I have a I have a friend from high school that's trying to help me do some social media outreach. So there's the Wolf Ranger. It's a YouTube channel. There's a Wolf Ranger Facebook page. I think there's a Instagram account called the Danimal Manimal. So all these are links that'll be found on the website though. There's also a GoFundMe for anybody that's interested in donating directly to my work. Any of that's super appreciative. It's completely dependent upon funding. So like I said, sometimes I end up volunteering hours. And though I don't mind that, I need to be able to feed the horses and feed the diesel bill and pay for the home. So, but yeah, check that out. That'll lead you to the other
Spell it one more time,
that you can learn more about my work. Very appreciative of the opportunity.
Spell it one more time, the website.
Yeah, it's G.R.I.P. Oh yeah, okay. G.R.I.P.H.S.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Yep, that works.
Yeah, it's just Griff. Yeah. And anybody that you can point to that. I do outreach. I do all kinds of things. I've got a really cool opportunity now that I'm trying to kind of solve all these equations by, the division that we were talking about, at least in Washington, from Western to Eastern. I'm actually doing ecotourism to try and fill that void and bridge those connects. So like, instead of marketing like, hey, a lot of people basically want to donate to this, and it's like, well, that's cool. And a lot of people donate to, nonprofits that are doing a lot of good work, but they don't know where it went. And instead of that, it's like, well, come pay for a tour that I'll take you on. We'll go listen to wolves and I'll teach you how to track them. And we'll go talk to a rancher and eat beef that you're actually watching and guarding. So now you're actually part of the process. You've become the solution. So that's a really cool iron in the fire that I have now that I'm super excited to see move forward and grow, because I think that bridges the disconnect. It takes out the politics and the pseudoscience, and it really puts people right at the round table together. And that's what I've been going for. And it also is a self-sustaining funding platform for ranger at this point.
No, this has been great. Man of many talents, Daniel Curry. No, thank you so much for your time. You're, again, awesome work. Please check out G.R.I.P.H.S.com. Again, that's G.R.I.P.H.S.com. Daniel's doing some awesome work. Again, Daniel Curry, thank you so much, my friend, for doing what you do, and continue to do it. You're awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Thank you guys very much. It was a pleasure meeting you, and look forward to connecting with you again in the future. So Thank you for your time and trying to bring some light on the subject.
Yeah, absolutely. How's to you all out there, and we'll talk to you next time.
Absolutely.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Looking to support Wolf Connection or sponsor one of the wolves in our pack? Just go to wolfconnection.org, click on the Donate tab, and find out more information.